My name is Alex, I am 27 years old. And for most of my life I thought I had everything figured out. But the truth is nothing about my journey was simple. Nothing about my story was predictable, because behind the pictures of me smiling at family dinners, the vacations that looked perfect on Instagram, and the polite small talk at gatherings, there was always a storm brewing, a storm that began the day I stepped into a house that never wanted me. The day I married Jason, a man I once believed was my whole world, not realizing that the true shadow in our marriage was not him alone but his mother, Vivian, a woman whose wealth and influence made her feel untouchable. And from the first day she laid eyes on me she made it clear that I did not belong, her smile a mask, her words knives wrapped in silk, slicing at my worth, my background, my dreams, telling me I was lucky her son even noticed me. And Jason, instead of being my shield, sat silently, his loyalty chained to his mother rather than to his wife. And I truly tried, to play the perfect daughter-in-law, cooking meals I knew she would criticize, dressing in ways I thought she might approve of, biting my tongue when she humiliated me in front of her friends. But each year that passed eroded a part of me until the night of my birthday, my 27th birthday, when I had prepared a small dinner, hoping maybe Jason would for once look at me the way he used to, hoping maybe Vivian would give us space. But she arrived anyway, sweeping into the house like it was hers, sitting at the head of the table, dismissing my cooking as if it were scraps, laughing as she compared me to women Jason had dated before. Women she claimed were better, stronger, prettier, more deserving, and Jason, as always, laughed with her, pouring her wine while I sat invisible on a night that was supposed to be mine, and later, lying in bed with tears burning but refusing to fall. Something in me shifted, something snapped. But not in a destructive way, more like an awakening, because in that moment I vowed quietly to myself that I would no longer be their victim. I would no longer beg for a place at a table that was never meant for me. Instead I would build my own. And so began my secret journey. A journey of learning, of observing, of planning, because Vivian thought she was untouchable. But I saw cracks. I saw the late-night phone calls she took in hushed tones, the panic in her eyes when someone mentioned taxes, the charity donations that never seemed to reach their causes, and I began piecing together a puzzle, taking courses online under the excuse of finding a hobby, but really arming myself with knowledge in digital strategy, marketing, even cybersecurity, teaching myself how to move silently in the shadows, because if Vivian's weapon was power and cruelty, then mine would be patience and intelligence. And while she continued to mock me, I smiled and let her believe she was winning, all the while collecting evidence, emails that proved embezzlement, recordings of her ordering her aides to forge documents, bank statements that showed stolen money flowing into hidden accounts. And I waited, patiently, until the stage was set, until the perfect moment arrived to expose her. And that moment came with her annual charity gala, the crown jewel of her social reign, where cameras flashed, politicians clinked glasses, and the city bowed to the queen of philanthropy she pretended to be. But what no one knew was that I had prepared a silent strike, one keystroke away. And as she stood on the stage that night, giving her speech about generosity and kindness, the giant screens behind her flickered and came alive with the truth. Every document, every audio clip, every transaction projected for the whole world to see. Her own voice echoing through the hall as she laughed about stealing money from hospitals, about pocketing funds meant for children, and the crowd gasped, the air thick with disbelief, while reporters scrambled to capture every second. And Vivian froze, her mask cracking in front of hundreds, and Jason, sitting beside me, finally turned to see me not as the weak woman his mother mocked, but as someone who had been underestimated all along. And though he begged me later to stand with him, to protect the family name, I had already chosen, because this was not just about revenge, it was about freedom, it was about reclaiming my life from years of silence and humiliation. And so I left that mansion, not with diamonds or riches, but with something far more valuable, my dignity, my truth, my freedom. And as the sun rose the next morning, headlines screaming Vivian's downfall, investigations already beginning, I looked at my reflection and for the first time in years I smiled. Not the polite smile I wore for others, but a real one, because I knew I was no longer the girl who had been stepped on. I was Alex, 27 years old, a woman who fought back not with screams or violence but with intelligence, patience, and truth. And I knew my story was only just beginning. A story where I was finally the author of my own fate, no longer living in anyone's shadow, no longer begging for acceptance, but standing in the light of my own power. But freedom, I quickly learned, was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of an entirely new one, because while walking away from the mansion and from Vivian's empire felt like victory, the reality of rebuilding a life from nothing was harsher than I imagined. And in the weeks that followed her downfall, my name began to circulate in whispers, not only as the woman who exposed the great Vivian, but also as the outsider who had dared to challenge power. And though many praised my courage, others warned me that enemies do not forgive so easily, and I felt that weight every time I walked into a cafe and conversations hushed, every time I scrolled through social media and saw my face mixed in with news articles, half portraying me as a hero, half as a manipulative schemer who destroyed her own family. And Jason, unable to decide if he was more angry at me for betraying his mother or more ashamed of his mother's truth, sent message after message begging for another chance, telling me he had been blind, that he had chosen loyalty to the wrong person. But every apology felt hollow, because he had watched me suffer for years and done nothing, and I could not return to chains disguised as love, so I silenced my phone and began pouring myself into something new, something entirely mine, starting with the skills I had secretly sharpened, the digital strategies, the marketing knowledge, the ability to tell stories through visuals and words, and I decided to build a brand not just for myself but for others who, like me, had once been silenced or underestimated. And so from a tiny rented apartment with peeling paint and second-hand furniture, I launched my first freelance projects, editing graphics, designing thumbnails, creating social campaigns for small businesses too overlooked by big agencies. And though the pay was small, the satisfaction was immense, because every project was a brick laid in the foundation of my independence. And slowly I began to attract attention, clients appreciating not only the work but the resilience behind it. And one evening, as I sat hunched over my laptop with empty coffee cups scattered around, I received an email that would shift everything again. A local NGO working on women empowerment had seen my name in the news, not just in connection to Vivian's downfall, but also to the small projects I was building, and they invited me to design their next campaign. A project far larger than anything I had attempted before. And, though fear whispered that I was not ready, courage reminded me that I had walked through fire already, so I said yes, and for weeks I immersed myself in their cause, listening to the stories of women who had been silenced, abused, or dismissed, their voices trembling with pain but also with hope. And as I translated those voices into visuals and campaigns, I felt pieces of myself healing too, as if their courage fed my own. And when the campaign finally launched, it was not just successful, it went viral, newspapers covering it, television picking it up, and suddenly my inbox overflowed with offers, not only from NGOs but from businesses, artists, even politicians, everyone wanting a touch of the raw authenticity that seemed to define my work. And though success was intoxicating, I stayed grounded, reminding myself daily of the girl who had once been invisible at her own birthday dinner, the girl who had been told she did not belong. And I vowed to never let arrogance blind me the way it had blinded Vivian. But of course life does not move forward without shadows, and soon enough the shadows returned. Because Vivian's downfall had not ended her reach entirely, her wealth may have cracked but it had not disappeared. And whispers began reaching me that she was regrouping, using connections in darker places, determined to rebuild her empire and destroy the woman who tore it down. And though fear threatened to paralyze me, I realized running was no longer an option. I had to face the truth that my story with Vivian was not over. And one night, after leaving my office, I noticed a black car trailing behind me, its headlights too steady, its presence too obvious, and I felt the chill of danger pressing close. But instead of crumbling, I went home and began preparing, not just for survival but for war, documenting everything, alerting allies, expanding my network, because if Vivian thought she could silence me again, she would learn I had grown into someone who could no longer be easily broken. And as the weeks unfolded, my work flourished even under pressure, each success another layer of armor, until finally an unexpected ally emerged, none other than Jason, who appeared at my door one rainy night, soaked and trembling, confessing that his mother had turned her anger onto him now, blaming him for not controlling me, cutting him off from the wealth and security he had always known. And though part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, another part saw the desperation in his eyes, the vulnerability of a man stripped of privilege. And against my better judgment I let him in. And over steaming cups of tea he admitted truths I had never expected. That he had always admired my strength even as he failed to support it. That he had felt trapped in his mother's shadow too. That he had loved me in his own broken way but never known how to choose me over her. And though forgiveness did not come easily, his presence reignited something unexpected, a new layer to the story, a possibility not of rekindled romance but of unlikely alliance, because he too had seen the worst of Vivian. And together we began piecing strategies not of revenge this time but of defense, ways to cut off her influence permanently, exposing the last of her hidden accounts, connecting with investigative journalists, rallying the very women she had once silenced. And slowly but surely the tides turned, not only against Vivian but toward me, as the public began to see not just a woman who had exposed corruption but a woman who had built something from its ashes, a leader who represented resilience. And though my nights were still haunted by the fear of her shadow, my days were fueled by the light of creation. And as my agency grew, as my team expanded, as new opportunities arose to speak, to teach, to inspire, I realized that this was the story I was born to tell. Not a tragedy of a woman crushed by her enemies, but the rise of a woman who had turned enemies into stepping stones, pain into power, silence into a voice that echoed beyond walls. And even as Vivian's final empire collapsed under the weight of her crimes, I knew the real victory was not her downfall but my rebirth, because for the first time in my 27 years, I was not defined by who hurt me or who tried to silence me. I was defined by who I had become, Alex. The girl who walked out of shadows and into her own light. The girl who built a kingdom not of wealth but of truth, not of chains but of wings. And as I stand now looking at the skyline of the city that once ignored me, I know this is still only the beginning, because my story will not end in survival. It will continue in legacy, in the countless lives I will touch, in the unshakable truth that no matter how many storms come, I am no longer afraid, for I am the storm. But success, as intoxicating as it was, brought with it a different kind of loneliness, a subtle ache that lingered even in the glow of achievements. Because while my name was now known far beyond the city where my story began, while my agency had expanded into sleek offices buzzing with creative minds, and while my face sometimes appeared on panels, conferences, and glossy magazine covers that celebrated resilience and entrepreneurship, I would often return to my apartment at night and feel the silence press against me like an old ghost, reminding me that growth often costs companionship. And though Jason sometimes visited, helping untangle the last remnants of his mother's grip, his presence was temporary, his path still uncertain. And I could not lean on him for permanence, not after everything that had broken us before. And so I learned to embrace the solitude, to let it shape me rather than shatter me, focusing instead on the new projects that began to define this chapter of my life, one of which came unexpectedly when an international foundation reached out, inviting me to lead a global campaign about voices of the unseen. And though the scale was intimidating, teams across multiple countries, languages, and cultures, I accepted, because something in me knew this was the evolution of my journey, not just to survive or succeed but to amplify others. And soon I was flying across borders, standing in villages where women still whispered their truths behind closed doors, standing in cities where young creatives burned with ideas but lacked platforms, and everywhere I went I carried the memory of who I had once been, using that empathy to bridge connections. And as the campaign grew, so did the movement, sparking dialogues in universities, policy meetings, social media storms, and for the first time I saw my work ripple outward not in isolated projects but in waves, changing perspectives, inspiring rebellions of thought. And with that came recognition I never anticipated: awards, invitations to speak at global stages, dinners with leaders and innovators, moments where I sat across from presidents and CEOs who leaned in to listen to me, Alex, the girl once dismissed as unworthy. And though pride warmed me, I never forgot the dangers of power. The way Vivian had once sat in such rooms convinced of her invincibility. And so I kept grounding myself in humility, keeping my hands dirty in real work, meeting the very people whose stories were at stake. But, of course, New power draws new enemies, and soon whispers of sabotage began again, not from Vivian, whose final downfall was sealed when she fled into exile, but from corporations threatened by the narratives I was amplifying, brands who profited from silence. And one night after a conference, I found myself cornered in a hotel lobby by a man in an immaculate suit who smiled with cold precision as he told me to tread carefully. That stories can be dangerous weapons. And I realized then that the battles had shifted, but the war was the same. A war between truth and control. Between those who profit from oppression and those who dare to expose it. And though fear pulsed in me, I had already walked through darker corridors, so I did not flinch. I smiled back and told him that stories may be dangerous but silence is deadlier. And I walked away, more determined than ever, and in the months that followed I built alliances with other disruptors, activists, entrepreneurs, artists, creating a network strong enough to resist the backlash. But even as my public fight grew, my private heart wrestled with something deeper, because in all the noise of battles and victories, I realized I had never fully faced the wounds left inside me, the loneliness, the fragments of trust shattered in my years with Vivian and Jason. And so one evening I sat down and began writing, not for the world, not for a campaign, but for myself, pages of unfiltered truth about the girl I was, the woman I became, the pain I carried, the healing I sought, and what started as scattered notes turned into a manuscript, a memoir of sorts. And when it was finally published, it resonated in ways I had not imagined. Readers flooding me with messages that my story had given them courage to leave abusive homes, to start over, to believe in themselves. And in that moment I understood something profound, that while campaigns and businesses build change externally, stories, personal, raw, vulnerable, ignite change internally. And that balance became my mission, to build both structures and souls. And in time, my agency transformed into more than just a creative hub. It became a sanctuary. A place where survivors, dreamers, and visionaries could come together, where art and activism met. And as I looked around at my team, a mosaic of people once underestimated now thriving, I realized I had accidentally built a family, not of blood but of choice. And though the loneliness still visited me sometimes in quiet hours, I no longer feared it, because I knew I was never truly alone, my legacy already intertwined with countless others. And as I turned 28, standing on a stage in front of thousands, sharing the mantra that had carried me through storms. We are not defined by what broke us but by what we build from it. I felt a sense of wholeness I had never known, a clarity that this was not the end but merely another threshold, because life will always test us with new storms. But I, Alex, was no longer the girl walking out of shadows. I was the storm itself, carving paths, shaping destinies, unstoppable, unbroken, and infinitely becoming.